Welcome to Kingsdown School, Creative iMedia, Unit R081, Lesson 3, the properties and limitations of file formats for still images. So in this lesson, we'll be looking at the different types of image that we use in Creative iMedia, and also the different file formats for those different types of images, as well as what they're best suited for, and quite importantly, what they're not best suited for and what you don't use them for. Quite often in the exams, you'll be asked questions about this. You'll be asked what you think is the best file format for a particular item, and you'll not only have to explain what that is, but why you think that. So it is important to pay attention to this. It's also important for your Unit R082, which is the compulsory unit, where we are currently looking at designing an item, which will be then, normally speaking, finished off in two different file formats for different uses. Normally speaking, one is for print and one is for web or something like that, and therefore these file formats are especially useful to know about. Right, so let's dive in.
Today's objective is to be able to understand the purpose, the properties and the limitations of the different file formats that we use for the still images in our pre-production planning and in the actual production of multimedia. The success criteria is that you will be able to identify and describe the key elements of the formats and therefore be able to decide the suitability for use in pre-production documents accordingly. Now, what are digital graphics and why do we use them? Digital graphics is an envelope that covers basically all pictures, text, images, drawings and photographs that have either been digitally created or have been imported or digitized and continue to reside in the digital format. We use digital graphics for three main reasons. A good graphic will transcend the language barriers. There are in excess of 2,500 spoken languages in the world, and yet a single picture can actually speak all of them. A picture is instant in its delivery, so it makes it an extremely effective delivery method. And finally, even when we are dealing with people who do speak the same language, it often saves a huge amount of writing if we can just give one image that tells the story, as it were, and that saves the publishers time, and it also makes it much easier in terms of comprehension from the readers or the recipient's point of view. So how are digital graphics used? The use of digital graphics is now almost infinite, but the main uses are things like magazine covers, CD and DVD covers, adverts, web pages or web images, graphics in multimedia products and games. They're used for entertainment, to inform us, advertise and promote or educate. And so the different purposes and audiences therefore influence the designs and the layouts of all of these digital graphics, i.e. the use of the colors, the compositions, how the white spaces go, the styles, etc. So these are things that we need to be aware of. What is a file format? Well, a file format is another way basically of saying what kind of file is it we are dealing with, what properties does it have that either make it suitable or unsuitable for the task that I have to do at the moment. For the graphic formats, this will mean a type of raster or vector image. The file formats are usually identified by the final three letters after the dot in a file name. So when you've done your naming convention and you've put in your version control, then comes the dot, and then we generally use those three letters afterwards to identify what kind of file it is, and sometimes more appropriately, what type of program should be used for opening it. So as an example here, I've given you the village underscore scene and then dot PNG, and the PNG in this case is a portable network graphic, which is a raster image file type. Other examples include GIF, TIFF, JPEG, bitmap, PDF, and then EPS and SVG on the vector side. So what are limitations? The key here is a limitation is what the file format or type cannot do, does not do well, or is not entirely suitable for doing. Now, there will always be exceptions to these, but we're going to stick to the basic principles because there are times when we will all use things that possibly aren't the right thing to use, but will do, and therefore it's easier. So, or we don't have the right software to use, and therefore we just go with what we've got. Now, there are two main types of still image files, rasters and vectors. The file formats created in each of these types has further features which you must take into consideration when deciding the best format to use for whatever task you have. Those features or properties are such things as pixel dimensions, the DPI of the resolution, that's the dots per inch. Okay, so the number of dots per inch is the resolution, and that helps with the quality and also the compression settings. When we store most images, both moving and still images, we tend to use file formats that actually compress the original file to a much smaller one so that we can actually store it, or in fact so we can download it over the internet or send it over the internet, etc. So raster file types. As I said, there are two file types, raster and vector. The rasters basically work on tricking the eye into seeing an image which is essentially made up of very tiny squares or pixels of color. So that sort of is epitomized by the graphic that I've actually used on this slide, and there you can see the arrangement of the size and the pixels together and how they're tightly packed, and you can see there the effects that it has when you look at the picture normally, and you can also see how the trick works or comes apart then when you make it a lot bigger, and then your eyes can actually see how the dots are formed. And that's the basis really of the quality of a raster image. The better the quality, then the tighter the dots are actually put together and the more of them there are. So if you want to have a really good image quality, then you'll use a very high resolution of image, and therefore the image can possibly be enlarged without it necessarily distorting and the effect that tricks the eye becoming nullified. So once again, the smaller and more tightly packed the pixels are, the better the picture quality is, and the closer you can go in, or the larger you can make the image before it distorts and you can no longer have the effect of tricking your eyes. Vector file types, on the other hand, do not use any trickery. They just use simple lines and curves, and they also use a mathematical algorithm to then do any scaling. And this is one of their major advantages over rasters. If you've got a vector image, as you can see here, the smaller one, nice and clear. The big one, as soon as you make it any bigger, it's still entirely clear. And that's because that algorithm, that mathematical algorithm, is applied across the image equally, including any imperfections. Okay, so if you're making it large and you've got an imperfection when it was smaller, that will be emphasized and become bigger when the image becomes bigger. So that's a small drawback. But essentially, vector images can be resized without any loss of quality. Now, I would like you now to do exactly what I've done here and create a table either on a piece of paper, in your books, or even on a computer if you wish, using the names down the side here: bitmap, portable network graphic, joint photographic group, portable document format, tagged image file format, encapsulated PostScript, scalable vector graphic, and Adobe Photoshop document. The reason why I've just used those, they are the sort of more popular file types that we are likely to come across. we will not use very many file types that are not included in that list. Reason for that is mainly specialist software. We don't use an awful lot of specialist software. We use mainly generic software, and therefore those are the most popular generic file types. All of the ones from bitmap down to tagged image file format are of one type, and the ones below that are of a different file format, with the exception of the Adobe Photoshop document, and that's a bit of a red herring there. I'd like people to go away and have a look at that and see what it actually does come out as, because it's slightly different. Okay, so you can see here what I would like is the file extension and whether in fact it's a raster or vector. The relative file size, I'll explain that in just a moment. Let's go back to the file extensions first of all. In my example earlier on, I told you that the thing was a PNG, a portable network graphic. So therefore in here, the file extension I would like to use is a PNG, simple as that. So that's filled in as a PNG. Raster or vector type. Well, I've just told you that all of these top ones are one particular type, so I'll let you work out which one those might be. Now, the relative file size. This is where you're going to need to go away and actually have a look and find out what sort of compression is used on there and what sort of file sizes they start off at and what are they when they've been converted into these particular file types. I'd like you to list a couple of advantages that you can find for these file types and the disadvantages, and what is their predominant use, i.e. are they mainly for posters, or are they mainly on the use of the internet? Again, I'll leave that down to you to do some research and find out what each of those is best used for. So I'm thinking that's going to take you somewhere in the region of 20 to 30 minutes to do that. So I would, I'll stop in just a moment. The only thing I will point out is this little one here, Lossy and Lossless. That is the compression. Okay, and compression is how small a file size you're going to end up with once you've actually squished it and done things to it. Now, lossy means that the file has had items or parts of it taken out, and therefore the original file is no longer as it was. Although in a lot of instances you will not notice with the naked eye, it does mean that something is no longer there and it will never come back. Whereas the lossless compression, that means that when that file is compressed, it can be rebuilt again to its original size with the original quality. So that obviously has a bearing on which file type we might use in an individual picture or advertisement or whatever it is we're doing for multimedia. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to stop now, let you go and do that for a little while, and then we'll come back in a few minutes. Okay, so the thing that we really need to look at now is the suitability of a particular graphic for use. Now, the file format suitability for use will largely be determined by the features of the format, as we just said, things like the pixel dimensions, the DPI, the quality, the compression settings that I was just talking about, and the properties like the depth of the color palette. Okay, whether it's vector or raster does actually come into it, of course. Does it support things like transparent backgrounds? Is the compression used likely to be lossless or not? And is the resultant file size suitable for the application it's needing to be used for, like transfer across the internet? So for example, if you need to use something on the web, then smaller file sizes are probably going to be required. So it's going to be a lot quicker for you to download it on a particular web page. Whereas a commercial printer, who's say printing some exercise books or textbooks, if you like, they will be far more concerned that the file quality is of the appropriate for their use. So there's a clear correlation between the properties and the features of the file types and the format and their suitability for use in differing circumstances. I've put here a link for a guide to those file formats. I will include that with the homework, or I'll show my homework when I deploy this, and you can go there and have a look at that. Now, stages in creating digital graphics. This is where what we've just been talking about becomes really important, because the first thing we have to do here is identify the aim and the purpose and the target audience for your graphic. Once you've understood where it's going and who's going to view it and in what circumstances they're going to view it, then you can start to identify the assets that you're going to need to create. Now, digital graphics are one of those things where in some instances it's just created by you. Some instances it's just a photograph, but in many instances it may be an amalgamation of those things. So photographs, scanned images, library images, graphics, logos, all together. And therefore you need to identify the resource that you need to create that kind of digital graphic, i.e. digital camera, internet, scanner, computer system, and the specialist software to do that. You'll also need to think about legislation, i.e. the laws that cover this, i.e. the copyright laws, laws about trademarks and logos, intellectual property use, what permissions you would need to have, and what the implications of use are. And that applies to images used in digital graphics, whether you've sourced them or whether you created them yourself. There are still rules. Now, to ensure that the technical compatibility of assets in the final graphic is something else that you'll need to think about. So we've talked about the properties here, and that pixel dimensions and the DPI resolution, color palette, all of those come into play here, because you need to understand that if you're going to blend different mediums together, i.e. you've got a photograph or you've got something you've created or something that's been taken off the internet, all of those have got to be a sufficient quality to match the final quality that you need. So there's no point having a high quality photograph and then putting some poorer quality graphics and expect then to export that as a really high quality image, because you're going to have problems probably with the two lower quality images that you added, because they can't be made any bigger without them distorting. So it's important that you understand that. Now, creating the digital graphic using a range of tools and techniques with perhaps image editing software, etc., is again things that you're going to need to be aware of. How you do that, how you crop things, rotate them, increase brightness, contrast, do some color adjustments, blending, all of those type of things you will need to be aware of, and make sure that you've got the right software to do that. Then at the end of the process, you're going to have to save that digital graphic, as I said, in a format that's appropriate with the software that's being used. It also really ought to be appropriate for the software that you envisage it being used with by the target audience. And of course, when you come to export the digital graphic, it needs to use an appropriate format for actually transferring in wherever you're going to transfer it to. So if it's downloading, it needs to be appropriate for that. Or if you're going to send it via the internet by email, then you need to make sure that it is of the right format. And then thinking further than that, yes, I sent that and it needed to be sent by email, so it needed to be nice and small. But if at the other end it needs to be then printed commercially, then you needed to make sure that the quality of that graphic was suitable for that. So that's the stages in creating the digital graphics. You won't need to memorize all of that, but you will need to be aware of how some of these properties that we've been talking about have an effect on those particular stages in creating things for digital graphics. So here's now an example of what I was expecting your table to look like when it's filled in. So obviously you could just copy that, but I'm hoping you'd have done a little bit of research and come up with your own version of that. Got another little activity for you now. This one refers to the suitability of the file formats. And it says here that you are required to design a new logo for a gaming company. They need to have the logo appear on their website, on a 180 centimeter tall by 360 centimeter wide poster of a new game scenario, and on the promotional t-shirts, for which there are 7 sizes, for the launch event. During the design process, you are asked by the client to send over the initial draft copies by email for their approval. So let's just think about that. You've now got effectively more than likely 4 different formats that you need to think about here. One, a logo to appear on the website, then also to appear on a huge poster. Third format is for promotional t-shirts, which are going to vary in size. And then, of course, that the initial copy has to be sent to the client. So before you actually put it on any of these other things, it needs to be sent to the client. And it says in the question here, the format which you choose to send the files to ensure that all parties are able to view them. Explain your choice. So what I'm asking for there is, what file format would you choose to send a graphic to someone else whom you didn't necessarily know what software they have available to make sure that they could actually see what it is that you have produced? So have a think about that. I'm only allowing you about 8 minutes for that because most of those should come to you fairly quickly if you filled in your table correctly. That one should be a fairly straightforward couple of questions for you. So 8 minutes, and we'll be back shortly. Okay, well, as ever, there will be a homework for this. As you can see here, we're giving you one to explain why a particular file format is the most suitable for doing something, and that's a typical exam question. And down the bottom here, we've got another part, or another way that the exam board often asks questions, explaining one issue that needs to be considered when deciding a file format. So not only have you actually got to decide which one you're going to use, you've then got to explain why that is. Okay, and then down the bottom there is actually giving you another one, if you like. It's saying, well, if we weren't to use this particular file format, what other format would probably do the job? So first one, it says why PNG. The second one, what needs to be considered when we're deciding whether it should be a PNG or not. And then at the bottom, if we weren't to use a PNG, what would we use instead? Okay, so that's the end of today's lesson. Would like you, of course, to fill out these review questions. What are the 2 types of still graphic images we use in iMedia? Which file format can be opened by any device on any platform? If you filled in your table correctly, that should be quite obvious. What are the properties of file format? I want you to describe to me what they are, or what the also the limitations are. So both the properties of file format and the limitations of the file format. Describe to me what that actually means, and then list 5 still graphic image file formats. I don't mind whether they're raster or vector, I just need 5. Okay, well, I hope you've enjoyed that, and we'll see you next time.